So I can think of no better way to end this conference than to talk about the Supreme Court and whether or not you should disregard everything you've heard over the last 3 days. So we know that sometime around June, we're going to hear from the Supreme Court about the future of the health care law. It's relatively easy if the Supreme Court knocks down the whole law. We know what happens then. The whole law is gone. But nothing is easy. It's a lot more complicated than that. What happens if the Supreme Court just kills the individual mandate, the requirement that most people buy health insurance? So here we come to this issue of what they call severability. First of all, can the Supreme Court just pull out that provision, pull out that requirement? And second, if it does, what happens to the rest of the law? Is the whole law effectively gone? Can it sever just that one aspect of it? And if it can just pull out that one element, then there are questions. Will the rest of the law work if the individual mandate is gone? Currently, with the mandate, estimates are that 32 million people will be added to the insurance rolls. 16 million would come from expansions of Medicaid, and the other 16 million are estimated to come from through private insurance, through the healthcare exchanges. So with us today are Stuart Altman and Tom Miller. They both have bios with credentials a mile long. I'm going to try to give you just a few of the highlights. Stuart is Dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management and Professor of National Health Policy at Brandeis University, although he's spending a lot of his time these days at the University of North Carolina. He's an economist and a frequent contributor to Health Affairs. From 2000 to 2002, he was co-chair of the Legislative Healthcare Task Force for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In 1997, he was appointed by President Clinton to the National Bipartisan Commission on the Future of Medicare. He served as the chairman of the Prospective Payment Assessment Commission for 12 years. That is one of the predecessors to MedPAC, which advises Congress on payment policy in Medicare. Tom Miller is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, where he focuses on health policy with an emphasis on information transparency, health insurance regulation, and consumer-driven health care. He was a member of the National Advisory Council for the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality from 2007 to 2009. Before joining AEI, Tom was a health economist for the Joint Economic Committee. He also has been director of health policy studies at the Cato Institute. Before coming to Washington, he says he had a real life as a trial attorney, a journalist, and a radio broadcaster. To give you a little idea of where Tom is coming from, he's also the co-author of Why Obamacare is Wrong for America, which was published in 2011. So let's start off our discussion with both of our panelists talking about the possible scenarios. Given the possible scenarios here, how important is the issue of severability and whether the Supreme Court can just pull out the individual mandate without doing anything else? And what are the implications of the different possible outcomes? So let's start on my right with Stuart.
Well, thank you, Marilyn, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but I have to get something off my chest.
Uh-oh.
So, and we'll get into all the fine-tuning about the technical stuff. But first, given the fact that I really don't want to be here, I shouldn't have to be debating this. The idea that a country like the United States should be even debating the need for universal coverage is something that I find very difficult. But given that I'm debating this, I'm really happy that I'm doing it with Tom. Because, I mean, among those who don't really understand what a good society should look like, Tom is above the best. He has a great sense of humor, and he's...
he's setting me up.
No, I mean, I'm not really. And he's actually an honest guy. As a matter of fact, I recently heard Tom talk about this law, and he was very forthcoming, and he made a lot of sense. He said, look, these state people, they're really not that interested in the individual mandate. They really, their whole preoccupation is Medicaid, and the truth of the matter is they want to get rid of the whole law, but it was just a convenient, easy, maybe politically is sustainable and maybe legal issue about the individual mandate. So really, your fundamental question, Marilyn, is not the individual mandate. It really is a serious attempt to do away with the whole law. And we can talk about how the thing will work if they sever it. But I do think we're going to have to talk about what's our country going to look like without any of this law, because I think that's a real possibility. Now, I mean, you know, if we're going to have a debate, I think the people who are against the law need to be upfront and said, look, I don't believe in universal coverage. If it happens by some miracle, that's okay. Maybe there are a few things we can do. Because the reality is that when the Republicans have been in power, the proposals that they've come up with to really do something don't add up to a hill of beans. I mean, and I'm not against a lot of them. I actually believe in markets. And if we can make our markets work better and become more efficient and do something about malpractice reform and maybe sell things across state lines if they listen to the mandate, those are good things and we should do it. But no one should be under the illusion that if we did everything that those proposals, even giving a little voucher of $1.25, isn't going to provide universal coverage. Now, if you want to be in a country that doesn't have universal coverage and doesn't think it's the responsibility of government to get there, you know, I don't subscribe to that, but it's a legitimate upfront position, and say it. But don't go through this dance, because the reality, Marilyn, is that there are really only two ways to get to universal coverage. One is to do a single payer, some variation. Every other country, industrialized country, has done it. They do it in many different forms. We can do it in our own uniquely American form. Or take our complicated, confusing, inequitable, good old American system and make it work better. And the truth is that the president chose the second. Far from it. This is not a radical proposal that has been proposed. It builds up, you know, we just finished a book, my colleague and I, on 100 years of analyzing this. This builds on the Nixon plan. It builds on Reagan's plan. It builds on the Medicare program that Johnson put forward. It is making the Tinker Toy set that we call our healthcare financing system work better. Now, your question at the end was, can we sever out the individual mandate from the rest of the law? And I think the answer is obviously yes. For those of you who remember the debate between Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, Senator Obama, and I was an advisor to Senator Obama, was not a supporter of the individual mandate. Nor do many Democrats. I mean, it was people like me who pushed him and said, sir, if you really want to get the universal coverage, you need to put that in there. But you can do a lot, and we need to talk about it. You can do a lot by doing away with it. If we keep the insurance exchanges, the subsidies for people to buy insurance, the expansion of Medicaid, all the reforms dealing with redesigning the delivery system, there is a lot in this law that is good for the American healthcare system. Would I prefer it be left alone and that the Supreme Court would play lawyers as opposed to politicians? Yes. I don't think this is a legal issue. I think this is an issue about what people want of our country. And the law is sufficiently in the middle. It could go either way. And you can make an impassioned argument why this was opposed to the Commerce Clause and so on. That is not the issue. The issue is, what should our country look like at the end? And from my point of view, having everyone have access to the financial so that they can get medical care when they need it in a fair and equitable way is a country I want to live in. Obviously, there are people, and many Americans, that don't share that. But maybe, and I'm not too optimistic, the Supreme Court will allow the law to go forward even if they strike the individual mandate. And I think if they do that, we will be a better country for it. Thank you.
Okay, Tom.
All right, I'll start with a legal analysis and then follow up with a humanitarian one to deal with Stuart's points. On severability, it's whatever 5 votes the Supreme Court decides. They've been inconsistent on severability in the past. The best legal version as to the standard they should use, although they may not get a majority of the support, is would Congress have passed this law if the individual mandate wasn't in it? Both through the structure of the way the votes unfolded, how there was only one place to go after all was said and done, you would take out the entire law because the individual mandate was the political glue that held a lot of other things together, and it would not have been passed narrowly without the individual mandate. The Supreme Court may not use that approach. There's a functionality test. Would the law function as intended by Congress without the individual mandate? Here as well, most of the law, if not all of the law, is very vulnerable. It's all interconnected in a badly wired system, but essentially, you know, the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone. You go all through this, and basically, the individual mandate sweeps into the exchange structure, which is the centerpiece of all of the coverage expansions. You won't have people enrolling in Medicaid, as we currently have it now with an individual mandate, because people prefer not to be in Medicaid in a lot of cases. It's not just an undercount. Sometimes people won't go in until they're signed up for it. So that expansion is not going to happen to the same degree. In a similar vein, the employer mandate loses all of its teeth because people aren't going to the exchanges, which are vulnerable on other legal grounds. There'll be a lawsuit coming after the Supreme Court if they don't knock this out. So all that is what the constitutional and the legal side of this is. What will the court do? I think it'll hesitate from knocking out the entire law, but there's a lot of territory in between something and nothing. The possibility of the court saying, well, just take out the individual mandate without at least the related insurance regulation provisions, primarily community rating and guaranteed issue, which the Solicitor General's already conceded that point. Those would go out as well, so insurers don't have to worry about going bankrupt tomorrow as opposed to in 5 or 10 years. But there are a lot of other elements of the law, which we've argued in a amicus brief, that relate all to the entirety of Title I and arguably some of the revenue-raising aspects and even Medicaid expansion, which would all be vulnerable if you do this as a legal analysis. Politics is a different story. Now let me switch to the other issue. This is framed as, are you for or against universal coverage? That's the only issue, yes or no. The issue is really political power and accountability. That's why this made its way to the Supreme Court, because what may have been some noble ambitions or desires were carried out through improper means. That's why we have a Constitution. That's why we have laws. That's why you can't say you're doing one thing in passing a law and turn out to be doing something else. That's why this was attempted to be done through the Commerce Clause rather than through the tax and spending powers of the Congress, because it didn't have support politically to get it through that way. So it's trying to smuggle in a large expansion of government under false pretenses has been called into account in the courts. In the same way, the reason why this polls so badly throughout the countryside and remains a plurality, if not a majority, opposed to the law, skepticism about it, even more powerful is the fact that the individual mandate, even if it doesn't apply to people personally, just is against the grain of what people think are the boundary lines between what the government can ask you to do or command you to do, as opposed to what we should do willingly. Now let's switch to what are some solutions here. This is not the only way to find a solution to our chronic problems in healthcare. We've been going down this road through decades, and all the people have been advising you, we've got the solution. They've actually failed. Let's talk about some other ways to do this. There are counter proposals. First, we have to clear the debris of wasting our time for 2 or 3 years and all the interest groups buying into saying, well, maybe we can live with this and comply with it. So what would you do? What would the next Congress do if it turns out under a different political scenario? There's a package of proposals. You have to straighten out the financing of this. You work off of a defined contribution platform. You are more generous to lower income and higher risk people. You have to repair the safety net. You have to put real funds into high risk pools that mean something, not even the ones in the current law. You have to have continuous coverage incentives for people to choose coverage because they'll be protected against pre-existing conditions if they maintain their insurance coverage. You expand that over to the individual market. You have to have a different approach to regulation, not the micromanagement all run through a federal system, and particularly with Washington more involved, that says, here's the product you can have, here's who can offer it, you can do it this way. It just is going to collapse of its own micromanagement. So there's a different approach to that, which is more information-based, value-based, to allow people to choose. But it comes down to that ultimate decision is who gets to decide. We've had people in Washington, we've had politicians, we've had regulators decide for a long time. That's why we've got the mess we have. So we've got to turn it loose to have a more decentralized approach, which allow people to find more attractive insurance products that aren't mandated for them and actually be willing to buy them and end up being healthier.
You know, if I believed for 1 millisecond that those areas that you talked about, Tom, would have come about, I would have a very different view. We've had 25 years, much of it under a Republican administration, and not a thimble, a little pieces of those ideas came out. The truth of the matter, and I'm willing to put a little money aside, maybe like Mitt Romney, you know, but take out all the zeros. So how about $1? $1 says that, you know, in my worst nightmare, the Republicans gain the presidency and the Congress. I'm willing to bet you that $1 that we will not see 10% of the list that you just gave. Because the list you gave is an interesting one. Truth of the matter is, I'm willing to get...
It's pretty much boilerplate among congressional Republicans at this point.
I'm pulling big money up against you. I'm willing... This is serious. I'm a professor. $1 is important. So...
Hey, your book's in hardcover. Mine's only in soft trade
Okay,
press.
all right.
Yours was selling to the 1%. I had to deal with the rest of America.
Well, I hope to reach Mitt's level in due time. But the point is, we are not going to see that level of willingness to put serious money up front to essentially coax, bribe, encourage people to buy coverage. We are not going to do it. And if we were, sure, we could have gotten it in different ways. And you're absolutely correct. We had to go, the Democrats and the president had to go this route because the amount of money you have to put forward, if you're going to essentially encourage, call it the right word, incentivize, not a term, bribe, encourage people to buy it on their own or set up a very expansive safety net is very expensive. And so, yes, we went down the road, which is expanding Medicaid, which is much less expensive, the individual mandate, which requires people to buy it as opposed to encouraging, and the likes, because it would have cost not $1 trillion over 10 years, but 10 times more than that. So anyway, I got my $1, and we can put it aside after the debate.
So because Washington is a fairly negative thinking place a lot of the time, there are proposals out there already, not formal proposals, but there's a lot of discussion about what you do if you don't have the individual mandate, how you encourage people to get insurance, what are some of the carrots and sticks to doing that. So, Tom, you say there are some ways to do that.
Sure.
Stuart, you're very not so sure. So let's start with you, Tom, on that. Spell out for us what some of the leading ideas are that are being discussed right now about how to do that, and then we can have Stuart knock those down.
Well, the building block I mentioned before, and this has been around for several years, we've already had experience with this in the employer group market, which is what HIPAA ratified in 1996, maybe less of a problem in reality. But it basically said as long as you maintain continuous insurance coverage, you're not going to be held up with new pre-existing conditions or underwriting on the basis of your individual health status when you move from job to job. There's been a gap in the system, which is when you move out of the job-based market, individual market, there were some soft protections. They weren't very well done. And in addition, you had to exhaust your COBRA coverage. So that's a building block which says you're a member of the club, you've done the right thing, you continue to be charged at standard rates relative to geography and age if you maintain continuous coverage when you float from one insurance arrangement to another with only minimal gaps in between. You have to bolster that, though, because people are going to fall through the cracks. Imagine that's going to work perfectly is not the case. That's why you've got to put real money into appropriately structured high-risk pools which say, we're not going to punish you beyond a certain point. Yes, you're going to pay a little bit more for your insurance coverage above standard rates if you're high risk. You're still coming out way ahead in most cases because your bills may be 3 or 4 times as much. So that needs real federal subsidies, real money, not the way the law is structured, which says first you have to be uninsured for 6 months, and then maybe you might go through this, then we'll give you a discount
So you
rate.
think, just pausing there for a minute, high-risk pools have not had great success. So you're saying, what would you need to do to change it to...
The primary reason is they're underfunded because the states only climb up that hill so much, and given their fiscal picture at the moment, the reality is without federal money, they're not going to find it somewhere else under another bushel. But I often talk about doing this in several tiers. The standard tends to be about 150% of standard rates for the high-risk pool. There's an argument that maybe you could go even higher, but then you have to combine that with income-based subsidies. Because there's two different worlds. There are people who have difficulty getting insurance because they're high risk and their premiums are going to be very high, and they're not going to be offered coverage. That's one problem. The second problem will be they don't have enough money to pay for even standard coverage. So we need to distinguish between those two problems. We often combine them together. So if you subsidize people saying, we know you should be sensitive to taking care of your health and paying more for what you cost more than someone else, which is anathema to folks on the left. They think everybody should pay exactly the same price regardless, and it'll all be cross-subsidized underneath the table. But then on top of that, we need to be sensitive to lower-income people who need additional assistance, because saying to them, well, here's 150% of standard rate, that may not be good enough for those folks. We've got to rearrange these subsidies. We spend so much time subsidizing the upper middle class and all the folks who vote and thinking that this is essential when they'd still buy the insurance in any case. And we say in the name of compassion we have to do this as part of a political deal. That's why we don't have the money to go around to help people who are disabled, who are lower income or higher risk. So let's talk about retargeting those subsidies on a need-sensitive basis.
The reason why I started the way I did was because I knew we could have a sort of a fairyland discussion. It's not that what Tom is talking about is a bad idea. It's just not going to happen. And the reason why we know that is because when the people who are now so opposed to it were in charge, they didn't do it. They didn't even come close. The idea of having a high-risk pool paid for substantially by government and others to take care of it, great idea. I've been supporting that for years. The idea of making the market work better, totally support it. So this issue about if you can find a different way to get there, and the way you're suggesting, is not a bad idea. The reason why we went the way we did is because we could not get the money to do that, and that the system wouldn't do it. Remember where the individual mandate comes from. This is a Republican idea. This was not generated by the Democrats. This was generated originally by AEI. We had a governor up in Massachusetts that demanded it in our health care reform, who's now going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. Why did he put it in there? He put it in there because he didn't want to spend the kind of money that would take to do it without it, A, and B, he believed that everybody should have an obligation to have health insurance, because what's happening now is a gigantic Ponzi game where millions of Americans wind up sick at some point in their life. They go to the emergency room or the hospital or the clinic, they get free care, and then the healthcare system overcharges those of us who have private insurance so that the system has enough money to pay. It's a gigantic Ponzi game. So, Marilyn, we should not have a discussion on an alternative way, because it isn't going to happen. What is going to happen is nothing. Absolutely nothing, which means 50 to 60 million Americans with no health insurance, which means the continuation of the Ponzi game. And for those of you who are in the delivery system side, and depending upon that Ponzi game, it may be nearing its end. I just don't know how much longer we can continue to do it until the employer community sort of erupts and says no more. So that's the discussion we're going to have. What will our healthcare system look like 5 and 10 years from now with no healthcare reform law and no changes from our existing system, if not worse?
Well, Tom, why are you so sure that some of these changes could possibly happen? You know, given the negative public opinion about healthcare reform, wouldn't one believe that doing anything afterward would get the same negative reaction from the public?
Depends on your political scenario. I think if you've taken the thorn out of the paw of the lion, which is the individual mandate, you've dealt with kind of the major objections to the current law, but not entirely. We still have serious problems. They're not going away. We've just gone on a detour for several years and have to come back to it. Now, if you give me a political scenario where we have a change in administrations and we have a Republican president, or at least one will say is one at the moment, and that brings with it undoubtedly, I think, a Republican Senate, Through reconciliation legislation, you can pass this the same way it was rammed through in reverse by the Democrats. You've had to see change. Now, how long will Democrats hold the grudge? Pretty long, I think. They'll be pretty upset about a lifetime's work being cashiered. It probably will happen more smoothly if the Supreme Court takes out most of the law to begin with. But in any case, you can't just say, we're going along and getting along for another 4 years without doing anything. The problems are too great, and they're much greater, obviously, in terms of the other entitlement programs, Medicare and now Medicaid on steroids, let alone this latest entitlement in terms of the private health insurance system. Stuart was partly transparent and not fully transparent, saying, here's why we did it this way. The reason they did it this way is not only could they not afford it openly running it through the tax system, they can't even afford it if Americans know how much they're spending for this. So what we need as a beginning part of reform is to get the price tags back out in the open. People actually need to know what they're spending on health care. Now, people in health policy circles go, well, that'd be wrong because then they wouldn't buy this insurance. They wouldn't want to spend this much money on health care. That tells us that something's fundamentally wrong in our system. When you're that mismatch between what this area of service and product costs relative to what people are willing and able to spend or would even support politically to do. So the beginning of this process is getting back to real prices, real costs, a sense of what you're getting in return for your money, and finding out that when you have to meet the market where people are willing to have so many resources and not more, you do things differently. There are a lot of delivery system reforms which show some promise, which could move in this direction. The problem is scalability. Is this going to be another case of asexual reproduction? We've got one of them and they can't mate with anything else. So the question is whether they can scale up there. I think you'll find the Republican side, once we're out of the make-believe world, a great deal of support for the other part of the law, which deals with all the delivery system changes and payment changes. Clearly, Medicare is going to have to lead on this front. If you don't change Medicare, you're not going to be able to change the rest of the healthcare system. That's where some productive work could occur, and it all got bypassed because we had to do the usual political game of hide the costs under a different basket so you don't know what's going on, while massively expanding the political power and control in Washington over the rest of the healthcare system, which has enough trouble working on its own in a more decentralized manner without thinking everybody's got the answer here.
When it comes down to it, is this about cost or coverage? The cost of health care or covering more people?
They're interrelated. I mean, but if it costs too much, you're not going to get there, no matter how you think you can conscript private money from someone else to pay for it.
Well, we're not going to turn ourselves into totally around. Look, when I started a long, long time ago, we were spending in the early 1970s, when I actually worked for a Republican, Richard Nixon, who actually did a lot to, and if we had only passed the law he had put forward, it would have, first of all, looked a lot like the Obama health plan. But the point is we were spending $75 billion, 7.5% of our GDP. Today we're at 2.5 trillion, we're at 17.5%. So what are we going to do? The best we can hope for without turning our country into a pickle would be to slow the rate of growth. I mean, you wouldn't have all these people in the audience, all the United Healthcare, the World Congress would go away if we really would have cut healthcare spending by 10 or 20%. So we're talking about an expensive system under any set of circumstances. Am I in favor of transparency with prices? You bet. And I take exception a little bit, Tom, I'm sorry. There was no attempt on the people that I know to say, well, we don't want to tell people what it costs. That's nonsense. That was not the issue. The issue was the first one, and it's much coming from the Republicans. They didn't want to spend the money. They would not spend the kind of upfront money then, and they won't spend it next year or the year after to really do this by just getting people out there, giving them vouchers or whatever. So let's talk about, now I'm very pleased to hear that you're willing to think about keeping a lot of the reforms on the delivery system, which I am working very hard to see working. You know, we've been there before, Tom, you and I. We know how many good ideas we've had in the past 30, 40 years. You know, I call this the ACOs and bundled payments the new thing. You know, we've had a lot of new things. Health planning, we've had some on the government side, we've had managed care. So the question I would ask the audience, and Tom, and myself, is do we have the political will to really make cost containment, whether it's on the market side or on the regulatory side, work? And up to this point, the answer has been no. And I'm not sure we've changed all that much.
Well,
because cost containment takes money away from people. And people who lose don't like to lose.
well, Tom earlier used the term defined contribution. So what do we do with that term?
That's the distinction between public political money and private money. There's everything positive about people willing to spend their own money to do better. There's lots of money in this country, and a lot of it will be spent on health care when it provides something in return for what people are willing to spend. So we have to sort out the difference between what we can do through the revenue spending system, which has a certain ceiling on it. Last time I checked, we were a little overcommitted. Now, we could move to single payer, but that single payer might be China, which is not a great approach in the long term. So the question is, what do we need to do through public spending to ensure that the people who can't afford this on their own have the necessary assistance? It means taking a lot of the middle class off of welfare and not playing that game where we're passing the money back and forth and it ends up being a net loss, because when you run this through the tax system, you get all kinds of deadweight losses and inefficiencies in addition to the centralized control, which keeps us from getting to the type of responsive healthcare system which will make a difference. At the same time, what Republicans need to do better is to put up their bona fides and say, we are willing to put that support in for the people. And there are a lot of people who need that assistance. It means you don't blow up Medicaid twice as large when you're not doing a good job with the current Medicaid system. You focus more on the people who are disabled and on long-term care than the below 65 temporarily low income. We have to heal this economy. We have to have more people who are less dependent and are more independent and doing better. So you have to look at this in a larger eco-structure. When we go to things like the World Health Congress, everybody thinks healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. Am I getting my dollar? Am I not getting my dollar? There's another world out there. How are we going to rebuild the human capital we need in this country to compete internationally and to grow better and more prosperously? How do young families educate their children? How do they do these other things without just buying an insurance policy, which is twice as much as they would be willing to spend and can afford? Those are issues we don't talk about. We're inside this health ecosystem bubble, which thinks we can swallow everything. There might be some money left over for us to do some other things if maybe the economy grows enough.
So that, I want to talk about Medicaid. I think that's a good transition to take us to Medicaid, because the Supreme Court is dealing with that also. But I also want to remind the audience that you can ask questions via email. Sleeper issue with the Supreme Court is Medicaid. It is also considering whether the federal government has the right to do this Medicaid expansion. A number of states are very concerned and are complaining about that they are being coerced into doing this Medicaid expansion, that the federal government within this law is going over the line between offering them something, because Medicaid is optional, states don't have to take it. They are saying that the federal government is crossing the line and actually coercing them to do this, because simply they feel like they can't live without the extra help, but they can't afford the expansion. So this is the part of the discussion. In addition, there's even if that stays put, even if the Medicaid expansion stays put, and you have the severability issue, you take out the individual mandate, but the rest of the law stays put unless somebody removes it or it falls apart, you still do then have the Medicaid expansion, which is estimated to be 16 million new enrollees. So what do we do with that? Those are really two separate questions, and let's start with simply the question of severability, since we've already started talking about that. If the Supreme Court does kill the individual mandate, does that mean the Medicaid expansion takes place as is, and that's pretty much what the health reform law does? Is that where we are?
It could. That's probably a Justice Kennedy call in final analysis when you get to a majority. If you look at the oral argument, most of the justices are very uncomfortable with picking and choosing and saying, I'll take one from column A, one from column B, and doing severability analysis. So you need some clear, clean lines. What's a wild card?
So are you saying you think the Supreme Court is going to either not do severability, it's going to do everything or nothing?
Or something that is very simplified, which says, here's a structural reason why all these things fit together. Medicaid is in a harder category. What the wild card on this is, if you listen to the oral argument and some of the tones, there were justices who were a little, surprisingly more on the fence and having some problems with this Medicaid coercion. If this isn't coercion, when are you coming up with it? Now, admittedly, there's been a lot of examples in the past of holding the states hostage, saying, if you don't take this mandatory coverage, we're going to go ahead and do this. However, for instance, Justice Breyer seemed surprised that the discretion of the Secretary of HHS was so wide open or in any administrative procedures, that you literally could by fiat say, sorry, you're out of business tomorrow because you didn't go ahead and do this. This is the maintenance of effort and the expansion on that front. There's a possibility that you can get several justices who may not come on board on the individual mandate, who have problems with Medicaid being unconstitutional, and then Chief Justice Roberts could do a mix and match saying, I got a majority for something being unconstitutional in the law, and you've got a wider scope for what gets knocked out. We don't know that. This is what will be revealed in June, but there's a possibility that Medicaid could be vulnerable on that front as part of a package saying it's not section by section analysis, it's kind of a broader issue as to what's a provision that's unconstitutional, which has a different legal interpretation on it.
You know, Marilyn, again, we're not, even if I'm not a lawyer, Tom was trained as a lawyer, but now he's been practicing economics, so I think this is the wrong question, I'm sorry.
Give us the right question.
The question is, what will the world, I don't know what they're going to do. The idea that somehow this is coercion, but when the original Medicaid law was put into, it was okay, because there's far more money in the original one than there is in this one. Now, you know, where's the line? I don't know. That is an issue. But the question that I think is fundamental, and it's fundamental to all of us, is suppose all of Medicaid would be thrown out. I don't know why this edition would be thrown out and the rest of Medicaid would stay in. You can make the case that it's all coercion. The federal government essentially said, I'm willing to give you billions and billions and billions of dollars, but you have to do X, Y, Z, and H. You have to cover people on certain kind of women and children, regardless, and people at a certain time. I mean, if you're going to define that as coercion, it's all coercion. So the question we really have to ask ourselves:
it's the marginal coercion.
Yeah,
Stuart.
well,
I
don't know where the line is. You tell me. As far as I know, the Constitution didn't draw a line. I remember in Massachusetts we had a bunch of people who I didn't think were so smart, but they actually were holding up the seatbelt law. You know, we wouldn't pass a seatbelt law in Massachusetts, and the federal government said, fine, you don't have to pass it, but we're taking all your highway money away from you, and the Strategic Air Command will no longer protect Massachusetts.
I thought you were outside.
But feel free to keep your seatbelts off.
I thought you were outside our defense perimeter.
We decided that the Strategic Air Command was important. So we passed the law. So you call it, I thought that was pretty coercive. Now, actually, I'm in favor of the seatbelt law. It was okay. The point here, what would our system look like? What would the delivery system look like? I mean, I sit on the board of a hospital that is 25% Medicaid. We provide millions of dollars, particularly to poor children. We feel we're terribly underpaid, but we continue to do it. We have developed a delivery system that affects us, the haves, in more ways than we know. And if all of a sudden we start pulling the pegs out, Medicaid first and then Medicare, the whole system is going to collapse. This is no longer the issue for them. This is the issue for all of us. And I can't make the call on what the Supreme Court is going to do, but I do believe that if they declare this unconstitutional, the Medicaid side, and then we start allowing states to begin to really experiment, including the possibility of cutting back on services that they don't want to pay for, or cutting, or going to like the block grant and let the states do what they want, our healthcare delivery system is going to take on a very different pale, and we're going to have to talk about what that's going to look like.
Sort of like in Rhode Island, where it turns out with the capped entitlement, they got happy people at a lower cost and ended up changing around the delivery of services in a more effective manner. You could do that now, and I'm in favor of these state initiatives. And I think what Rhode Island did was interesting. I think what Oregon is doing. So yeah, I do believe, I'm on your side, I do believe we should give states more flexibility. But I think we should establish some line that says, okay, we'll let you do flexible things. Some states much more managed care. Some like Rhode Island and Oregon, which I really like what Oregon is doing. Sure, I'm in favor of that.
And I think we have been too rigid. And some people, I'm not one of those that, I like I think what we did in Massachusetts in terms of our universal coverage was very important. I'd like to see other states do it. We're beginning to seriously...
You got there first. Everybody else can't get the same block of money.
Well, you're going to spend all this extra money. Why not give more money to the states? I mean, that's a way. That's not inconsistent, I hope, with your plan. Let's give more money to the states to experiment with that kind of stuff if you want to move away from Washington control. I think that's a bugaboo, Washington control. Okay, let's take it away. But Washington has a lot of money. We have to admit that. So what's our healthcare system going to look like? And let's get back to that issue of there's a lot of activity going on in this country. And that's why these people are here in terms of redesigning the delivery system, bringing about more incentives, getting the market to work better. I think that's important stuff. And I would hate to see if the law is totally found unconstitutional. There has been a lot of seed money built into that law that is being spent now by delivery systems, whether it's through bundled payments or the ACO, the Innovation Center, that's going to get ended. And I think that would be a shame.
Well, we certainly have a problem of the health policy industry and the elites, a lot of vested buy-in. Don't take away what I've spent 2 or 3 years figuring out how to comply with, how to do all my business plans, and that's actually, the base for support of the law continuing. But what has been misunderstood in this debate since its very beginning is the rest of the country isn't on board with this. That's why this actually came from outside of Washington in terms of opposition, not just Tea Party. It's that, yeah, this works all well for you if you're kind of part of the system and we can cope with this. We're going to be the survivors. We're going to be the final incumbents who we may be junior partners with the government setting most of the terms, but we're still in business and we're still, making our revenue totals. That is misreading the larger mood in the electorate. And we're not in 2010. We don't know where we're going to be in 2012. But that's what's been always out of sync in this. It's like inside the bubble, it seems like we can live with this and we can comply with this. But it has gone against the grain of how a large block of the country thinks of this centrally driven approach to healthcare that hasn't talked to them.
That sounds right, but what's the largest group opposed to the reform, age group? It's the over 65 population. This over 65 population, protected by this so-called bubble called Medicare. Now, what do they say? Don't you tread on my Medicare. And
keep the government out of it.
Keep the government out of it. And so when you listen, I went around the country listening to a lot of these congressmen that voted for the law get thrown out by the over 65 population because the over 65 population was screaming that somehow the reform plan was going to make their life worse, that it was going to negatively affect Medicare, which was not true. Yes, there was some money taken out the rate of growth, and I'm not going to get into it, but there was a lot of good things in there. So the point here is it wasn't so much that the rest of the population didn't know what was going on. What the rest of the population was sold a bill of goods was that somehow this healthcare reform was going to make their life worse. And they said, not on my watch. I'm not my brother's keeper. And if I am, I'm surely not willing to see any reduction in my quality of care or access to care. So the problem that developed was partial information, but a lot of misinformation. And of course, it was demagogued to death by the politicians. I mean, the Democrats are going to do the same thing. Ryan is going to be, the poster boy #1. If there's somebody that's going to get Obama reelected, it's Congressman Ryan, because now we're going to paint him as destroying the Medicare program. It's not true. The Ryan plan would not destroy the Medicare program. But I'm going to get up on the stage if I have to and say, oh my God, poor Medicare is in a lot of trouble. Just like you did. I mean, I wouldn't do a thing like that. And I'd never do it at the World Congress. Never. But the point is we need to talk about what this healthcare system is going to look like if that thing gets thrown away, which I think it very much could.
Nobody's throwing away Medicaid.
Medicare, I'm on Medicare. I'm very much afraid. I tremble every night that somehow the likes of, not you in particular, but your ilk is going to throw out Medicare. It makes me very, very nervous.
You can look at the numbers on the Medicare proposal for
No,
Ryan. It's
fortunately-
very slow moving.
You're right. I'm not that nervous because I know they're not that
It's people like
stupid.
me who have to be.
That's right.
It's my age group. Okay, so we have about a minute left, and if we lose the individual mandate, if the Supreme Court knocks out the individual mandate, and part of the law, the whole law, whatever goes, what is worth keeping? Aside, we're not talking about the individual mandate now, but are there pieces of it that are important, that actually should be kept? There might be a consensus to keep them. What do we want to save?
Well, I'd like to hear Tom, because from my point of view, everything. Because I think there's a lot of good stuff in there on individual coverage. As I said, on Medicaid expansion, I support it. I support the exchanges. I support the idea of subsidizing people. And most importantly, I think we need to redesign the delivery system. And there's a lot of good movement in that direction. But I think Tom, you know, the kind of list that he gave before is an impressive list, and I'd like him to repeat it.
We need to do the same objectives differently. We need to tease out the creation of value information in a little less centralized manner, but there's some building blocks there. We need to obviously change the way Medicare pays for the services it receives, and that's the greatest leverage on the rest of the healthcare system. Let me just make one historical addendum, though, because I've let it pass before. This nonsense about Republicans and the individual mandate. That was a bad idea by some Republicans a long time ago, which wasn't repeated. And there's just not any history beyond that. They used to call those constructive Republican alternative proposals, best known for their acronym in the old day of the 60s and the 70s.
Then why did Mitt Romney feel it so necessary, and he brought up a whole bunch of our friends, and it wasn't just a little fringe element? I mean, he demanded that we have the individual mandate in Massachusetts. It was not the Democrats in Massachusetts that put it forward.
Yeah, it was a defensive tactic, and I think that if he was running for president, thinking of it back then, he wouldn't have done it. He was outside of the mainstream of the Republican Party thinking and the grassroots. And the folks who proposed this in the 90s didn't get any great support either, and that's why they stopped proposing it, because it just did not echo with where the actual voters were.
Okay, so
It's funny, I didn't hear any of that then.
So we'll be waiting for some kind of a decision from the Supreme Court in June, and after that, I'll be checking in with the both of you to see how your $1 bet went. Although I'm
That's
not sure
right.
you
As a matter of
took
fact,
that
I'm willing
bet.
to give it to Marilyn. Why don't we both give you the dollar, and then you decide. But the point is, I'm willing to give my dollar up and not see the Republicans take control of the Congress and the president. So
All right, we'll
I'm
leave
willing
it.
to bet on the American people, and I don't have to put dollars down.
that
on
makes me feel. That's wonderful.
All right, thank you both very much.